In this module, we're going to apply what we looked at in the last module with middleware by actually setting up some authentication. Now, I'm going to do this in 3 different stages. In this very first lesson, we're going to do a very basic authentication that you probably shouldn't use, but it at least implements middleware in a way that I think helps it make sense. Secondly, we'll look at it in Firebase. So we're going to use a service and basically let them store all the passwords and all that kind of stuff. And all we're going to do is basically interact with their SDK. And then finally, we're going to roll our very own with Lucia Auth. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with this first one. I'm in the branch and I'm just going to go ahead and start with a basics template. If you do this command here, you can skip all the questions and just say yes to them all, and then apply a basics template and skip Houston, and I'm naming it lesson 102. Okay, so there we go. It installed everything. Let's go ahead and jump in VS Code and get this up and running. Okay, we should be set and ready to go. And the next thing we need to do is go ahead and set up a middleware file. So again, this is just in the root of the src directory. It's called middleware.ts. You can also use JavaScript if you want to do that as well, but we're going to just use this. Now, the first thing we have to do is export a const that is called onRequest. And then you might remember we get a helper called define middleware, and this helper will make sure that it's typed correctly as well. So we're going to say context and next, and this should be context. Sorry about that. Next is the function that will just forward along the request. So we could say return next like this, and it will essentially hit this middleware between each request and then just forward it on to where it was supposed to be in the first place. So not super helpful yet, but what I want to do is actually comment this out for now, and we're going to return something else. Now, this is something that comes in the browser. It's kind of an old school way of doing auth, but if I come in here with response, what we're going to do is say auth required in this object, set up the status of 401, and then we'll have headers. And here's where the magic happens. I'm going to say www, that's all uppercase, authenticate, and then we'll do colon and a single quote, basic realm equals secure area. So obviously super basic here. If you don't want to type all this, you can just grab it from the repo below. But now what will happen is as soon as I refresh, and I'm going to need to actually start my dev server again since I added a middleware file. Now if I come back over here, it should give us this super basic auth, right? So what I want to do is go ahead and capture whatever I type in here. Once I have a username and a password, it will actually attach a header for me called authorization. So let's go ahead and grab that here. We're going to call this auth header equals, this will be for my context.request.headers.get authorization. Now this will automatically encode this in base64. So not super like secure or anything, but it is actually encoded. So let's go ahead and now type this out, and then we should see this log in the server. So I'll say Chris and whatever, and sign in. And if I jump back over here, you'll see that I've got auth header basic, and then right here is my encoded string. Now, technically the way it's encoded is it's like this. It's username colon password. All right. So what we want to do is extract that out from the auth header. So let me come over here. For now, I'm just going to say if auth header, then I want to go and grab the auth header. Now, probably the easiest thing to do is just to split off that end string. So what I want is this string right here. So I can grab all this as a string and split it on this space and then grab the second item in the array. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to just call this auth value, and this will be for my auth header dot split. And remember, we're splitting on an empty string and just grabbing the second item in the array. Now, it's possible that this doesn't exist. And so if it doesn't exist, I'm going to manually pass in username colon password. So this little nullish coalescing operator essentially just says, hey, if this thing gives me null, then go ahead and pass me this right here. Okay, cool. So we should either have our username and password just like this, or we should have this one right here, username password, which obviously will not be the one that we want. Now, what I want to do is decode that base64 string. So let's just say like decoded value for now. And I'm going to use a built-in function called atob that should do that for us. And I'm going to pass in my auth value. And once again, I need to split it, this time on the colon. So let's say split, and then we're going to split it on the colon. Now, if I go ahead and console log this decoded value, now if I type in Chris and password, and then I remember to spell atob correctly, there we go. Now if I do it again, Chris and password, whatever that happens to be, if I come back over this way, you'll see that that function decoded that base64 string, and I got it here, Chris and password. So it's in an array, so we can just destructure this if we want to. That's probably the easier thing to do. I'll say username and password. So now that I've got both of those, what I can do is check them against just a hard-coded string. Again, this is probably not the way you want to do auth, but it explains how you can interact with middleware. And that's really what I want to cover in this very basic overview. So we're just going to hard-code some values. We'll say if username dot to lowercase, if this equals Chris, and if the password dot to lowercase, this equals, we'll just say password. Don't do this. All right, then what you'll do is just return the next function, right? So this is what we're going to do if it does exist and it matches the actual strings we want, Chris and password. Otherwise, we will return this right here. So let's come back over here. We'll say Chris and password. And if I sign in, now it actually lets me go to this home page. Now it's saved that automatically for us as part of the header. So if I close this browser and open it back up, then I'll have to re-authenticate. Otherwise, it'll actually stick around. So to make sure that we actually can see it work again, let's go ahead and just say it needs to be passed now. And now it doesn't match. So I can come in here and say Chris and pass, and now it actually will let me pass. So there we go, a very, very basic authentication. Now let's go ahead and do a couple other things because you may want to protect just certain routes. So you could do the same kind of thing, and this will help us think through the middleware. So if we come over here to pages, let's go ahead and copy this. We'll say that we've got an admin route, and in here, let's go ahead and just get rid of all this. And I'm just going to say main, and this will be admin. And let's do this one more time. Let's call this like secret. All right, some kind of secret route. And this again will be secret here. Okay, so only these two routes we want to protect. This index route we don't care about. So let me go ahead and close all those down. Let's come back over here to our middleware, and I'm going to change this back to password. So right now it should pull up this. Now what I want to do is set those two routes as two options here that I want to tick through first of all and check which route I'm going to be on. So let's say const protected routes. We're going to make these equal to just those two strings. That would be admin. These will be the path names we get, or secret. All right, so what I want to do is say, hey, if it matches one of these, then go ahead and do all my auth check. So let's go ahead and destructure the path name. We'll get this from context.url. Again, this is just something we get as part of the context. So now I've got both of these. Let's go ahead and pull this down. And I want to wrap everything we've got right here with another little if statement. So we're going to say if, and in this case, we're going to have protected routes dot includes, and what I want to know is if it includes the path name. So if it includes the path name, I want to do some stuff. And if it doesn't include the path name, I just want to return next. So just keep on going your way, right? So if it is admin or secret, then we're going to do all of our checking here. So I've got all that in my clipboard. I'll just repaste it in here. And now if I come over here and refresh, and let's see, I might need to cancel this. There we go. Okay, so now this is just fine. However, if I come over here and I go to secret, you're going to notice it throws up this little splash screen. So now I would need to type this in. Same thing if I go over here and we go to admin. So these two routes will be protected. However, if I go back to the home page, you'll notice it's totally fine. I can just access it like normal. So this is how you might pick off certain routes that you want to protect especially. Now, you could obviously make this more complex if you wanted to, but I think this shows the basic benefit of using middleware. Middleware allows you to intercept the request, and before the server ever sends back the page, you can check, hey, is this my protected route, and do they have the right auth header? Assuming that they do, you let them through. Otherwise, you throw this right here. And again, if it's not one of those protected routes, you just forward along the request like nothing ever happened. So a very basic example here, but I hope this helps you understand the benefit of using middleware for auth. Next, we're going to apply this with the solution you might actually choose, and that would be using Firebase. Now, Firebase is just a stand-in for a type of service that handles all the auth for you and essentially just gives you pre-baked functions that you can use to handle the auth. So we'll have to set up our own login state and all that kind of stuff. But as soon as we do that, Firebase gives us all the tools and stores all our usernames and passwords for us. Okay, I'll see you in the next video. Hopefully you see the benefit now of using middleware for auth. Now let's actually set this up using Firebase, which is a real solution you might choose and kind of a second option here for you. This would be one where you let a service take care of your usernames and passwords and any authentication like functions you need, and you simply just write all the logic that you need on the front end and tap into their SDK. That's what we're going to do here. Now, before we get started, you'll need to grab the starter code, and I've got it linked in the description. Go ahead and npm install it and then npm run dev to get it up and running. I do want to talk you through a couple of things. First of all, I've added just one adapter here, and that would be for Vercel, and then everything else should be stock from like the very like minimal package. The other thing I've done is I've got a layout here that's just got some basic CSS. I'm actually using Adam Argyle's open props, which I really like. And so it does a lot of the stuff for you, and this normalized package is pretty aggressive, so we don't have to worry too much about styling. Everything is then just slotted here in this main slot. And right now I've simply got the single route here that says successfully logged in. You are now seeing protected content. So let me come back over here. We'll just npm run dev this to get it up and running. And if I come back over here and refresh, we should be up. Okay, successfully logged in. You are now seeing protected content. Obviously, it's not protected yet. That's what we want to do. So in this first lesson, what we're going to do is initialize a new Firebase project, install Firebase itself, add our config, and just kind of get set up and running. So let's come back over this way. I'm going to come to Firebase. And if you expand this, you can see go to console, or if you're on a smaller screen, you can grab it here as well. What we're going to do is start a new app. I happen to have a few apps here that I've been playing around with, but you'll just want to click new project. And here I'm going to call this Astro Course Module 11. Okay, so we'll hit continue, And then I'm not going to turn on analytics, but I will create my project. Now, this may take just a couple of seconds, and some of this flow may change by the time you see this. Really, this is just an example of how to use it. And if you have specific questions, feel free to ask in the Discord, and I can try to help you if you can, or others will as well. All right, cool. My Firebase project is ready. So I'll hit continue. And then what I want to do is set up an actual app. And this is going to be a web app. So I'll click this little web button. And again, we'll just name this something like Module 11. And I'm not going to use Firebase hosting. Let's just register the app. Now I need to add the Fire SDK. This allows us to interact with the services that we want. In this case, it'll just be the one, and that would be authentication, although you can use this for other things as well. So what I'm going to do is install this right here. So let's jump back over this way, close this down, and install this. And while that does its thing, I'm going to go ahead and copy this out. Now this right here allows us to interact with Firebase. Even though it has an API key and auth domain and all this kind of stuff, you actually control access to things like your database using the database schema that they give you, the rules, the Firebase rules themselves. Now here, we're just going to use this for auth, so we don't need to worry about that, but you do need this in your project. So let me go ahead and come over here, and I typically like to add this in an SRC directory. We're going to call it Firebase, and then I'm just going to call this config.ts, and then I'll paste this all in here. Okay, cool. Let's come over here. Looks like we got that installed correctly. Let's npm run dev and get this thing back up and running. Now, we need to just add one service here, so let's continue to the console. Then I'm going to go ahead and pull this to the side, and then I'm going to go ahead and click authentication right here. Now, authentication here should allow us to get started, so I'm going to click here, and this essentially says, hey, I can use authentication in this particular project. Now, you do need to go ahead and pick different auth providers. We're going to keep it really simple and just do this email and password one, so let's enable this here. And then I'll click save. We've got just a single method then set up right here. We should be set to go. Now, what we need to do in the way that Firebase works now is you can just import individual functions you need. It just separates those out. And in this case, all we want is the auth function. Now, the way Firebase works is just whatever products you want, you just have to basically grab their libraries, the individual SDKs. So let's go ahead and do that. What we're going to do is import get auth. This will be from Firebase/auth. And then we just need to initialize this get auth app. Now, I'm going to actually do it right here. You could do it in other places if you want, but for me, it's easiest to keep it right here. So let's actually export this because we want to use it elsewhere. We're going to call it project auth. And we'll just say get auth, and we have to pass it the actual app itself, which as you can see, the kind of config we copied in already gave us that. So if I pass it in like this, now we should be able to use this wherever we want to using project auth, and then that will give us access to everything we might need in the auth. Okay, cool. So we can actually log stuff in if we need to. What I want to do next is set up a couple of forms that we're going to need. So in the next section, we're going to set up a login form and a create form. So for creating a new account and for logging in. I'll see you there. Okay, let's go ahead and add some forms that we're going to need. And what I want to do is add 3 forms. Actually, I think I mentioned 2 last time, but one form is hardly a form. All right, it's right under here, underneath the main content. I want to add a little form right here. And right now we're just going to get rid of the action and then come in here, and I just want a single button in here. So this should submit it by default. And this button will simply say log out. So down here, you can see that now it says log out, and I get this nice styling thanks to open props. So one form down, not too hard, right? Let's go ahead and copy this index page, and the other forms are going to be routes themselves. So we're going to have a login route, and then we'll also have a create route. Right now, let's just use the login route. And this one right here, we can just say something like login. Now, to make sure it's really clear, let's say an H1 here is going to say login. And then I'm going to add a form as well. We'll get rid of the action for now. And we're going to have a few things. We're going to have an email. So we'll say that this is for email, and I'll give it the label of email. And then we'll have an input. This input will be a type of email. And then in order to connect this to that label, I need an ID of email as well. And then in order to get this as form data, I need to call this name email as well. And then finally, I want this required, so let's go ahead and add that as well. I'm going to copy this down one more time, both of those together, and we're just going to switch all these out. In fact, if I hit Command D a bunch of times, I've got an extension that will allow me to type both upper and lowercase differences all as one, and I can just type password, and they all update as they should. And then finally, I just want to add a button here. This button is simply going to say log in. Now, below the form, it's possible that they don't have an account, so let's go ahead and add a paragraph here that says like need an account, and then we'll just have a link that points to create, and this will say create account. Okay, so if I save this and we manually go over here to login, this should show us this form. So we've got email, password, login, need an account, you can create an account. Cool. Okay, so everything is working as we expect. I just need to now duplicate this and do the same thing for the create state. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll say create, and we'll just make a few changes here. Now here we're going to say create account. So in fact, let me hit Command D and grab all of those. We'll say create your account right here, and here we'll say create account. The email and the password should all be the exact same. And here should say create. That's good. We're going to say have an account here. And if that's the case, we'll simply say login instead. And here we'll say login instead. Okay, so let's save this. Let's go over here and click create account. That should take us over here. And now this says create account, all that kind of stuff, login. Maybe we want this to say create account. I don't know. Let's say create account. Okay, cool. So now we've got everything working. We've got this logout button as well. We've got several different routes set up. Now we actually need to set this up so it'll actually be functional. So in the next lesson, what we're going to do is write a little helper function that can take all of these forms and submit them to an API endpoint. So we'll set up the function, and we'll set up the API endpoint. I'm back on the layout page, and you can see that all of my different routes are always using this and just dropping in their content here, which means this will be available on every page. What I want to do is let's go ahead and close out this style script, and I'm just going to go right above here and add a little script tag. What we want to do is grab all the forms, that would be the logout form, the create form, and the login form, and access those and pass them all along to a helper function. Now, obviously, I don't want to just grab like all form tags like this, because then, I might have other forms on my site. So let's go ahead and do this. Let's add a little attribute here. We're going to call this data auth form. So I know that anything with this data attribute should work, and that's what I actually want to capture in my script. So let's go over to the login page, and we'll add that here as well. So we'll say auth form, and then I'll go to the create page, and we'll do the same thing. Okay, so back over here in my layout, what I want to do is now capture all of these, and I'm just going to say const forms equals document.query selector all. And what I want to do is select anything with that particular data attribute on it. So we'll simply say data auth form, just like that. This should give us all of these as a node list. So we'll say node list of, and then this will be HTML elements. And again, if you're not using TypeScript, that's totally fine. Form element, just like that. Okay, so now we've got a list of node elements. These are all forms, and we want to pass each of these along to a little helper we're going to call form submit. So let's go ahead and come over here and create that helper first. And I'm going to come inside the src directory and create a new directory called lib. And then inside here, we're just going to have form submit.ts. Now for now, we're going to say const export form submit. And this should take in a form. And I can type this here with HTML form element. And that way I know what I'm getting inside of here. What I'm going to do here is set up an event listener on the form. So whatever form is passed in, I want to add an event listener. And the event listener will just be on submit. It should capture clicking the button, clicking using the enter key. Either way, however the form is submitted. Now I simply want to have an async function. So async, and this will just be an arrow function. And the first thing I want to do is e.preventDefault. Now, of course, to use the e or the event, I've got to put it here. So let's do that. e.preventDefault, and we'll close that off. And then I'm just going to console.log the form. And maybe, I guess, since we know we've got a data set on here, let's use the dataset.auth form. Okay, so that should at least tell us which form is being hit here. So back over here in the layouts, let's close the sidebar. I'm going to say forms.forEach. So for each of these forms, we simply want to grab the form, and we want to pass it along to that helper function. So form submit, and control and spacebar should pull that in with an enter key. There it is right here. And I just simply want to pass the form to it. Okay, cool. So that should work for me. So I've got an event listener. Anytime I submit an event, it should tell me down in the console here below. Again, this would all be client-side JavaScript, what I've done. So let's say like email@email.com, and we'll say something down here and create an account. And it should show me something here. I'm not seeing that. It was the data auth form. Maybe this needs to be auth form like this. Let's try it again. This isn't super important because we're not going to use it this way. I just want to make sure that we're actually getting what we expect. Something there, undefined. Okay. Anyhow, let's not worry about this for right now. We'll figure that out because I don't actually want to use the data attribute. What we're going to do is use another thing, which is the action that's built into forms themselves, and use that to decide where we want to send this. So we're going to create 3 separate API routes, one for deleting, one for creating, and one for logging in. And we're going to use the action on the form to decide what to do with it. So let's come over here. The first thing I want to do is come over to this action right here. We're going to add the action back in, and we're going to point this to the document, to the API route where we want this to be. So this will simply be /API/ and eventually we're going to have logout.json like that. Okay, cool. So let's go and grab this same thing and add the same thing to the login form. So we'll say login.json and then finally to the create as well. There are obviously other ways to do this, but I figured this is kind of the simplest to use a single helper function to set up all these event listeners. Okay, cool. So let's go ahead and create these. I'm going to create them in the pages directory since they're actual routes. We'll call this API. And then inside here, we'll have all 3 of these. So we'll say create.json, and this needs to be .ts. And And you might remember from these dynamic endpoints, these API endpoints, now that we're using server-side rendering, I can do things like post to all of these, and that's what I want to do. So let's start with this one as an example. We're going to export a const called post, all uppercase. We're going to pull in the API route helper. And I guess this should be async as well. And I'm simply going to grab the request because we'll eventually do something with that. So right now I just want to return a new response just to make sure we get something coming back. We'll just say null. And I'm just going to console log on the server here, like create route or something like that. Okay, so that should work here. So if I hit this with a post endpoint, it should actually say create route. Let's come over here and do the same thing. So we're going to say create route. This will be login.json.ts. And this will say login route. And then finally one more. Oh, I doubled up the TS's there. One more, we're going to change this to logout. And this will say logout route. Okay, so we've got all those set. Now what I want to do is come back over to my form submit. Let's close all those down. And after I prevent the default, I want to grab the API route I should be hitting based on whatever form I've got this event listener set up on. So at our most basic, we can just await a fetch here to our form.action. Again, that's just the action attribute that we added to the form itself. Then I've got this object where we have to specify the method as post. This ensures that the API endpoint we set up to listen for a post request is going to get this. For right now, we'll just set the body to null. Now that means if I come over here to create account and I have email at email.com and we do some kind of password and I hit create account, we should see this logged over on the server. So if I come over here, it says create route. Cool. So let's go over to the login route and try the same thing. So we'll say email at email.com and something else here, and we'll log in and jump back over here. And it says login route. And let's go one more time down here and just click the logout route. And that should do the same thing. It should say logout route. Okay, so we've got all three set up and working properly. Now, I know we did that a little bit quickly, so if that doesn't make sense, all we're doing is making sure that each of the forms have an action that points to the API endpoint we want to hit. Then they all have this data auth form on it, and that way we only grab those forms in case there's other forms on our site, and we simply pass them each along to this form submit helper. The form submit helper, if I jump over here with command click, all it's going to do is set up an event listener on each form passed in, and it's going to listen for it, and when that event is hit, it's going to use the form action to decide where to send the post request. Now, eventually we want to send along a body and all that kind of stuff, but we'll do that in the next lesson. So hopefully that makes sense how we set up the structure of this. In the next lesson, what we want to do is actually fill out this form submit so that it's sending along the email and the password where necessary and handling any basic errors we might get back. With all three forms listening and now having their own API endpoints, now what we want to do is use this helper function form submit to actually pass along the email and password that's been captured by the forms. Now, obviously the logout one won't have one, but it's not going to hurt us here to pass along any data that might happen to come along with the form. So we can do that with the form data API in JavaScript. So I'm simply going to say new form data, and then we'll pass along the form itself. So this will give us all the different values that have a name attribute. So that's why we had name, email, and name password. And that will allow us to capture all of these and pass them along to the body. Now, in order to do this properly, I need to do json.stringify. We're going to simply grab the object.from entries, and we'll simply pass in the form data. So this will give us all the form data entries as an object. So it'll be like email : whatever the email happens to be, password, same thing. All right. So now we should get this in our actual API endpoint. Now, to make this a little bit more robust, let's go ahead and wrap this with a try catch. So I'm going to paste this back in, and we'll capture this in a constant called response. That will be from await fetch. Now, if for some reason it's not okay, so eventually, like if there's an error with Firebase, for instance, this would not be okay. So we'll say response.okay. If it's not okay, then what I want to do is extract out the error from the response we get. So this will simply be const error. We'll destructure this from await response.json. So we should get back some kind of response, and then we'll throw a new error with that response error. So we'll say new error, and this will simply be the error, and eventually we'll pass .code. Now, this is something Firebase will give us, so this is what we're going to pass along to our little catch loop down here. So to start with, we're going to return an alert, and obviously you'd probably want to have a toast message or something better than this that just says an unknown error occurred. Okay, so that will be if we don't know what type of error it is. Generally speaking, we should be able to distinguish it as an instance of an error. So I'm going to use TypeScript here to say if error is instance of an error, then I know a little bit more about it. And what I can do is console log the error, and then I can also return an alert, and this will be the error.message. So whatever message we get along, in this case, it will be the error code that we get back from Firebase. Now, lastly, assuming that it is okay, so assuming it skips this loop, I want to do a couple of things. I want to take the form and I want to use the reset method on it to clear out all the fields, the email and the password. And then secondly, I want to window.location.reload. So I guess we don't have to reset the form if we're going to reload it. But what we're going to do is reload it, and then immediately the middleware will catch it and say, hey, they've already logged in. I can redirect them to the home page. So that's how we're going to handle that, just to keep it as simple as possible. Now let's go ahead and set up the first of these, and we need to do the create one so we can actually create something, right? So we're going to come inside here, and we should now get back the email and the password. So I can destructure these, email and password, because I know these are the only two things on the form. I'll get these back from await request.json. So whatever I pass in as the body of that post request, I know will be an object with an email and a password value. So let's just destructure those automatically. All right, next, what I need to do is have another try catch block. Now, Firebase gives us some nice functions, and this is the nice thing about using a service is you don't have to write all this kind of stuff yourself. And I'm just going to grab the user. We'll grab this from await, create user with email password right here from Firebase. If I click on this, it should import from Firebase Auth. Now, I need to give this three things. First of all, my actual auth project instance, we call this project auth. So if I start to type project auth, it should pull this in from my config, and it does right here. Cool. Next, I need to pass in the email and the password. That should use my config and pass everything along to my Firebase instance. Now, assuming everything is good, we can just return a new response because I have to return something here. And this will just be json.stringify, message is success. Okay, cool. Now, assuming that it's not okay, so if there's some kind of problem right here, I'm going to return a new response. And this will be json.stringify, and we'll stringify the error. And we'll go ahead and pass along a status of 500. I guess here we could also do a couple other things. We could pass along a status here as well. And I guess this would be what, 201? I think that's for created. And I guess we're not really using this, so let's not capture it. So there we go. So this should be set and ready to go. So as you can see, I've got this little helper function that as long as I pass along my project auth, the email and the password I get in, it should be fine and set to go, and we should get back a success message. Otherwise, it's going to hit this right here, and this will never be hit at all. Okay, cool. So let's come over here, and let's look at our users. And right now there's no users, but if I come over here and I add ones, we'll do like email at email.com. Oh, this is login. Let's create account. Email at email.com, and we'll pass in password or something like that and click create account. It should hit that endpoint and eventually come over here and refresh our page and reload everything. Now let's come over here and refresh and see if they actually got through. And look at that. We've got email at email.com and a new user that I got back. So we know it's actually working properly. Cool. So we got the first thing set and ready to go. Now let's go ahead and set up the logout function, which will be even simpler than this. And what this will allow us to do is to log a user out. So we can get rid of this console log. And here I'll just have another try catch block. And up top here, we want to await project auth dot sign out. Now this sign out function is directly off project auth, and it just signs the user out, any user that's currently signed in. Now, rather than duplicating all the code we already wrote, let's just grab all this right here. In fact, I might want to update this to say something like account created or something like that. Okay, so now let's come over here to the logout, and we'll do the same thing. So I'm going to paste all this in here and get rid of this bottom section. And this should all be set and ready to go. Here, I'm not exactly sure what it should be, so let's just do 200. And here I'll say logged out. Okay, cool. We actually don't use the request, so let's get rid of this as well. So now we can log out as well. Let's just double check that this is working. So if I click over here and I log out, I shouldn't have any errors, and we should be set to go. Last thing I need to do then is log back in. So let's come back over here. We're going to do the same kind of stuff here. So let's go ahead and copy a lot of this, and we'll drop all this here. Now here, we're not going to create a username with password. Instead, we want to log in. And for that, we have a sign in with email and password. Now, depending on which auth solution you chose, that may not be what you've got here, but this needs three things. Once again, it needs the project auth. I'll hit Command and Spacebar and pull that in. It needs the email and it needs the password. And then let's change this message here to say something like logged in. And again, I think this should probably just be 200. I'm not sure there. So now let's come back over here to log in. I've got email at email.com. And I think I had this as password. I guess we'll see. Now here, we don't have any way to see if we're logged in. So let's actually maybe come over here to the index route. And let's come up here. And I'm just going to go ahead and grab project auth because we can grab this. So we'll say like user ID or something like this. We'll grab it from project auth dot current user. And this will tell us if there is a current user. We just want the UID. So if they have a UID, we should display this down here. User ID like this. and let's see if they're logged in. So let's go back to the home screen, and you got to spell things the same way. There we go. So now I know I'm logged in. If I click log out, it should disappear because I'm no longer logged out. Okay, so let's get rid of this. I just wanted to make sure it was actually working. So now we've got it where we can log in, we can create an account, and we can log out. And again, that's the power of using something like Firebase. It's got all this built-in functionality. All you have to do is use one little method and everything works, right? Log out the same kind of way, and then log in the same way as well. Now, a little form submit handler handles all this stuff for us. Now, right now, it's only going to show this alert if there's a problem. So let's go ahead and come back over here. Let's go to the login page. And what I want to do is just go over to login right here. And let's not make the email required, just so we can get an error, because Firebase will need that even if our form says it doesn't. So I'll add some kind of password to hit login, and now it says auth invalid email. This is coming from Firebase, so I don't have to even check that I'm getting an email. All that kind of stuff is taken care of by Firebase. I can just pass along the error right here. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense what we did. In the next lesson, we need to actually apply this now with middleware, which has kind of been this whole setup process. Now what we want to do is have middleware that checks to see if a user is logged in. We can use that same thing we just saw a moment ago that we got kind of a sneak preview for, where we checked on Project Auth to see if there was a current user. So we'll use that to decide whether or not we should send them to the login page or the home page or whatever. Okay, so let's do that in the next and final lesson. We've got just one more thing to do, and it's the middleware. And believe it or not, this might be the simplest thing we've done in this entire little section on Firebase, because all we have to do is check whether or not the user is logged in and then decide where to redirect them to. So first of all, I need to come over here and just add in a new file we're going to call middleware.ts. Now, you can actually put this in a directory as well. We'll do that in the next section on Lucia Auth. And you can also pass along sequences of events, but we've been trying to keep it real simple so far. Now, you might remember this needs export const on request, and then we are going to use the define middleware function. That should come from Astro Middleware. That should import there, right there. Let's close the sidebar. This gives us two things. It gives us the context, and it gives us the next function. Now, what I'm going to do is come in here, and we can just return next at the bottom like this. So right now, all it's going to do is hit this middleware and forward on to the request that it was originally intended to hit. Now, let me come back over here because we changed that up. Let's npm run dev. Okay, so now it should actually be hitting this middleware for us. And we could make sure that's the case with console log, like hitting middleware. And let's come back over here, hitting middleware. Okay, cool. So it is actually working. Now, remember, all we have to do is check to see whether or not the user is logged in. So we're just going to simply check if they're logged in. And we can do this in a couple of different ways. We'll just say is logged in. And grab this from project auth.current user. Now let's go ahead and console log this just so we can see what's going on. I've logged out right now, and just to make sure, let's log out again. All right, now, and let's just look over here, is logged in null. So if they're not logged in, we should say null. Let's go ahead and log in and see what it says then. So let's say login. This was email@email.com, and this was password. Login. And now I come over here and look at this. We get a bunch of stuff. So we've got all their auth token stuff. Next, I need to decide where to send them if they're logged in or if they're not logged in. So the next thing I want to grab is the path name. So I can grab this path name like this. We'll just destructure it from the context.url. So again, this is just something that comes along with the request. Now I know what the path name is where they're trying to hit it. So I've essentially got two different scenarios. First of all, if they are logged in, so if is logged in, and here I'm going to wrap this in parentheses because there's two conditions. If the path name equals create and they're logged in, or if the path name equals login. If either of those are the case, then what I want to do is return context.redirect, and I'm going to redirect them to the home page. Now, we used a new response redirect earlier in the last module to actually redirect somebody using just a new response. But if you're in SSR mode, you've got this redirect function that comes along as well. So now if they're already logged in, it moves them back to the home page. In fact, if I try to come over to log in, it won't let me do that, right? Now, however, if I come over here to log out, and now I try to get over here to log in, it should just forward along the request because this condition is not met. So it just hits you right here. So there's another scenario, and that would be if is not logged in, right? So if it is not logged in, and then once again, we're going to have some other conditions. Now there's a tricky one here, but I'm going to say, and the path name does not equal create. That's one you probably thought of. And the path name does not equal login. But there's one more too, and that would be all my API routes, because those are technically routes. So I can actually check the method that was hit and say, I want to make sure that we're not worrying about post methods. I only want to think about get methods. So here I'm just going to say context.request.method if this equals get. So if we're not logged in and the path name is not create or login, and the request is get, so we're actually trying to get to a page, we're not posting somewhere, then I simply want to return to the context.redirect, and we're just going to redirect to my login page. Okay, so let's log in, or maybe before we do, let's try to go to the home page. So if I go over here, it's not going to let me do that because it hits this condition. So it's not logged in. The page I was trying to go to was the home page, so it wasn't any of these, and it was a GET request. So it's going to send me back to the login page. Now you might say, well, what about the create page? Well, remember, that was one of our conditions here. If it is the create page, then it's going to actually just let the request go on right here, right? So it'll skip this whole if block. So let's come back into the login. We'll simply say email@email.com and password, and we'll log in. Cool, so we're successfully logged in. Oh, look at that. Password is used in a data breach. Thanks, Google. I assumed. All right, so we should be set and ready to go. Now, again, if I try to go to login, it's going to redirect me back to the homepage because it catches this block right here. Or if I try to go to create, the same exact thing happens. However, as soon as I log out, it's going to refresh the page, and then the middleware catches me and passes me over to this login. I just want to remind you about that. So if I come over here to the form submit, you'll remember that whenever we submit one of these 3 forms, it's going to reset the form, which in this case, there's no inputs down here for the logout, but for these ones there are, and then it will reload the window location. As soon as it reloads, it hits my middleware again. So as soon as I click log out, and then starts all over at the beginning and says, okay, they're not logged in, therefore we skip past this, we check here, if they're on the home page, then it's not one of these, and it is a GET request, so we return them to login. And that's our project done. So obviously you could protect individual routes if you want to as well, using whatever logic you want, like we did in the last section with that really basic auth example. But most of our work was actually setting up the login forms and the API routes and all that kind of stuff, and the middleware was real basic, right? Now, in the next section of this module, instead of taking something like Firebase, where they store your usernames and your passwords and do whatever they want to with them, you get to store it yourself using Astro DB. We're going to make sure we hash it and use some kind of basic security practices, and we'll use Lucia Auth to roll our own. Rather than giving you like straight up functions, so if I come over here to like log in, rather than giving you things like sign in with email and password, it instead gives you the building blocks, and you can kind of create this function yourself. So it's a little bit more work, but you get full control over the entire login, logout experience. Plus, you get to control all your user data. Now, for some of you, you're like, I don't want to control my user data. I want somebody else to worry about that. That's just fine. Hopefully, this gives you enough to get started with. Now, we did not go over things like changing your password, so you could have like a password update. Again, Firebase makes that really easy. You could also have like a delete account or update account or add username or all that kind of stuff. And again, I'll leave you to that for Firebase. I didn't really want to make this about Firebase. I just wanted to use some kind of popular tool that would be easy enough to get started with. So hopefully this helps understanding how middleware works in the context of auth. In the next section, we'll look at Lucia Auth. We've reached the 3rd stage of our auth module. We're going to implement our own auth with Lucia. Now, Lucia is an open source library, and you can see here that there's more than 100 contributors, but what it does is it breaks apart all these like individual parts of doing auth and gives you each of the tools so you can kind of roll your own without having to trust another service like Firebase or Supabase or something else like that. So what we're going to do is essentially create an adapter where we'll pass in an Astro DB database where we will store hashed passwords and usernames. Then what we'll do is when people create a new username and password, we will store that in our database and create a new session. This session ID will be stored in the form of a cookie that Lucia can then validate. And as soon as they log out, we can invalidate that cookie. So we're going to do all this ourselves using Lucia. Now, first of all, to get started with, we're going to need to remove some of the things we did before. So what I'm going to do is come over here and remove Firebase. And if you didn't do that last section, you can actually download the starter code that I've got right here if you want to yourself. Next, I need to uninstall Firebase. You can do that with npm remove, and then we'll just do Firebase. This will remove it from our node modules. And then while we're over here, let's go ahead and install 2 things. I'm going to npx astro add db. This will add astro db. I'll say yes when prompted. And then now I'm going to install Lucia. Now we actually need to install a few things here. I'm going to npm I, and what I want to install is Lucia. Then we're also going to install Oslo, which is a helper for hashing our passwords, and then Lucia's adapter for Drizzle. Now, they actually do have something for Astro DB, but it's currently out of date, so I just want to stick with the kind of tried and true Drizzle adapter, and it doesn't look like the Astro DB one adds that much anyhow, so it shouldn't be that much harder to do it this way. Okay, so that should be everything we need installed. Let me come back over this way. And if I come into the middleware, you'll notice that here we actually are trying to use Project Auth, which is no longer going to be accessible, along with a lot of our other sections. So we're going to kind of remove these as we need to. So for right now, what I want to do, though, is get rid of this middleware so that it will actually still work. For right now, let's get rid of this. And we're just going to take all of this and comment it out. That way, whenever we hit a route, it'll just continue on to our route as we expect. And then we'll slowly add back in functionality as we're ready to go. In the next lesson, we're going to come into our Astro DB config here and set up 2 tables, one for the session that Lucia will actually handle, and then one for the user that we will handle ourselves. We need to create 2 tables for Lucia Auth. And just to see what's going on here, if I jump over here to the database, we're going to be using this Drizzle ORM connector for SQLite right here. So in fact, if I come over here and we look inside our node modules and I look inside this adapter right here, we can come in here and hit command click and see exactly what we need. So this is what we're going to be trying to recreate. I know there's a lot of stuff here, but as I move down here, you'll notice that we've got a session table. This session table needs to have an ID and expires at and a user ID. And notice that this ID needs to be the type of string, this needs to be the type of number, and this needs to reference the user object table. And if I come up here, you'll actually see that all I need is an ID. And I think this can be a type of string or a type of number. So we'll set that up here now. So let's come back over here to my config. That's what we need to create. And AstroDB, you might remember, we're going to declare a certain table, define it, and provide the columns that we need. So let's come over here. And up above, I'm just going to have one called session. This will be defined at table. And we'll need to pull this in from Astro:/DB. And then let's go ahead and copy this down. We're also going to have a user. Now here, I actually want to store a few things. We're going to have an ID on here. So let's first of all declare columns. And the ID here will be column.text. I'm just going to make sure it's unique here, unique true. We're going to actually generate this ID ourselves. And so we're going to be using a combination of numbers and letters. And I do want to set this as the primary key. So I'll set this primary key equals true as well. Now, we only need an ID, but I also want to add a few other things. I want the username. This will be column.text. And here I also want this to be unique, so unique true, and that way if somebody has the same username as somebody else, it should fire an error for us. We're also going to have a password hash, so we're going to hash this password to keep it safe, and I'll set this as a column.text. And then finally, I want to create it at property. This is just helpful to know when the user created their account. So we'll do column.date, and I can go ahead and generate this automatically if I use the default here. And we're going to set this to now, which is a function we get with AstroDB. So I hit enter, and that should import for us. Okay, so now that we've got the user, we can set up the session. So let's come up here. We're going to do the same kind of thing. You'll remember we need 3 things here. We saw that. We need a column.text. We need an ID. And remember, this has to be the type of text. I'm not exactly sure why they do it this way, but they do. So this is what we're going to do. We'll set it to unique equals true. And that way, each ID is unique. The second thing I need, according to that type we saw, was expires at. And this will just be column.number. And then finally, I need a user ID. Now, we haven't yet seen how to do this, but you can actually reference other tables. So I'm going to reference the user table directly here in the session. And in AstroDB, you just use the references like this, and you pass it a function. Here, we're going to have user.columns.id. So in other words, we're saying the user ID should correspond to one of these right here. Now, the final thing we need to do is just export both of these. So we've got a user and we've got a session. So that's everything we need for AstroDB. Now, if I jump back over this way, you'll notice that what we're going to do is we're going to use this SQLite adapter, and we're going to instantiate it with our database, then our session table, and then our user table. We're going to do this in an auth file that we're going to use whenever we're creating or logging in or logging out using Lucia. And that's what we'll do in the next video. We've now prepped our database so that it can be used in this Drizzle SQLite adapter. What I want to do now is instantiate this inside of a new file we're going to create, and we'll go ahead and create an auth folder just to make it a little bit easier for us. So let me close this down, come inside here, and I'm going to have an auth folder. So auth, we'll just have this be index.ts. Now, the way we're going to do this actually follows along with some of the Astro conventions they have here for username and password. So if I jump back over this way, they're actually generating all this themselves as far as their own database. This was pre-AstroDB, but we can use a lot of this same kind of logic right here. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this in just to minimize how much we're typing. Now I do need to have an adapter, and that's where our SQLite adapter comes in. Here, let's declare a constant called adapter, and then let's go ahead and use the Drizzle SQLite adapter. And for some reason that does not want to pull in for me, so that's fine. We're going to come in here and I'm just going to import it. So import, this comes from Lucia Auth and then adapter Drizzle. So that should be right. Now all I have to do is pass in 3 things. Remember, it's the database, then the session table, and then finally the user table. So the database we can import just like this from AstroDB. That's Astro:/DB. You see that pulling right there. Next, we're going to pull in the session, and then finally we're going to pull in the user table. Now right now I'm not getting type completion for this because I haven't run npm run dev yet. So let me just go ahead and come in here and we're going to add session like this, and then finally user like this. Just to make sure this is working, let's come over here and do npm run dev. And if I come back over this way, you'll see that now this typing is working properly. It's actually pulling these things in. Now, without getting into a bunch of complicated reasons, probably the easiest thing to type this database as is just as any, because basically we're just passing the database. We don't have to pass the structure. That's done right here. Now this can pass it right along to Lucia that can use this adapter when we're working with auth. Now, the couple of other things we've done here is set secure to prod, and we've also added a username as one of the user attributes that we're interested in, because we want to grab that and be able to update that for the user on the client, and just to make sure that our cookies are all matching with our database as well. So this will give us type safety to understand which attributes we've added beyond the defaults, which is in this case just the ID. The next thing we're going to do is use this auth module to go ahead and update our create.json.ts file. Now right here, we're going to have to see that we're going to have to remove some things like our project auth and replace all of this with our own custom logic. All right, let's get ready to actually create real users in our database here. What we're interested in is usernames and passwords, and we're getting those both from our checkout function or our create function. That passes it along right here, username and password, except we've got it set to email and password. So let's come first of all to our create route, and I'm just going to change these around to all say username, and then this type obviously needs to be the type of text. So this should be required, and this should be required. Both of these are going to get passed along using our little helper function. Now, you may have noted here that I've got this set to the action here, which we are using. I could just set the method to post, but there's some complexities with handling the errors, and I wanted to kind of stay focused on auth and not on error handling. So if you're wondering why I'm using JavaScript instead of just the default form submission in the browser, that's why I'm doing that. Okay, so back over this way, let's come here. What I want to do now is grab the email and the password, and we're going to piece this together instead of using Firebase. So let me get rid of all this. It also means we can get rid of this right here as well. Now, if I come down here in this little module they have, you can see here that they're telling you to grab this from the form data. We're just doing this a slightly different way because we're already grabbing the form data and just passing these along as string values here. Then they're doing a little check right here on the username, and then also on the password, and then passing back invalid username or invalid password, kind of depending on what the problem is. So let's do that next. Let's come right inside this try catch loop, and I'm going to write a function that's going to return two things that we're going to destructure: success and message. So the success will be true or false, and the message will be a string. Now let's just validate the inputs, validate inputs, and this will be the function we write where we are going to pass in two things in an object. One will be the username that was passed in, and the other one will be a password. So these should both be strings, right? Because we're getting these from the actual body that's been passed along. Now we need to write this validated inputs. Let's come over here and let's just do this directly inside of our auth folder. We'll call this validate inputs.ts. So export const validate inputs. And here this is going to take in two things. It should take in a username and it should take in a password. Now, just to make sure we're getting typing on this, let's set the username to the type of string and a password to the type of string as well. Now, we know that in the end, we need to return two things. So we're going to return success and we're going to return a message. So we'll do that in just a second here, but I guess we should also make this an actual arrow function. There we go. So we've got our validate inputs receiving both a username and a password. So let's come back over here and hit Control and spacebar to pull that in from auth validate inputs. Now we did change around the email in the form to say username, but we have not yet changed it here. So let's come over here, change this to username. Okay, so now let's go ahead and validate the inputs over this way. Now we could separate these out and have both the username and a password separately validated, but what I want to do instead is just validate them together. And that way, if somebody's just trying to guess a username to see if it's valid or not, they can't tell from the actual error message. So let's come over here and we're just going to grab this. In fact, let's grab this entire if statement and we'll do it right here. So we'll say if all this is true, then we're going to do something right here. Okay, so we've got, first of all, the testing of the string itself for the username. Now let's test the string for the password. So here I'm going to grab this as well. We'll just add this in as a condition. So here we want, if it's a type of password, so here we want to test the type of password to make sure it's a string, then the password length, it has to be at least 6 characters, and it has to be less than 255. Now, obviously we're using this for creating passwords, so you probably want to pass back a more specific error message here, but because I'm going to use this both for creating and for logging in, that's why I want to just have one single error message. And of course, if you want to build out a full robust auth, you probably want to do more work than what we're going to do in the simple module just to explain how it works. So if it fails any of these tests, all I want to do is return here two things. We've got success, this will be equal to false, and then we'll have a message which will be invalid credentials. Otherwise, I'm just going to return down here success, and here we'll have success equals true, and then message will just be an empty string. Okay, so now what we're going to do is validate all of our inputs and basically make sure that it matches these string qualifications we have. So back over here, we now know that these match what we want. Success will be true or false, and the message will be whatever our string happens to be. So right below here, we can just check off that success right here. We'll say if it's not successful, then we'll just throw a new error where we'll get our message we got back. So if we want to test this, we should be able to come right over here, and I should be able to come to my login, or actually it's my create, right? And then we'll add a username. So I'll say like Chris, and I'll do a password that's too short. So let's do like, I don't know, just a few characters. And now it says nothing. All right, so what we need to do is actually update our error message down this way. Because ultimately what I want is for this to read back to me what the error is. In this case, the error is what we just created, right? Invalid credentials. And the way we set this up on the front end was to take a message like this. So we'll pass along the error.message here. Now TypeScript doesn't know if this is technically a type of error, so it doesn't know if it has a message property. So we can do this in a few different ways, but one of the things we could do is come inside here and say error, instance of error. Then we want to pass along an error message. Otherwise, we'll just pass along the entire error like this. So either way, we're going to have something returned, and usually it should be the type of error, right? So it should actually pass along this specific message. Now, lastly, let's come over here to our form submit and just make sure that we're actually getting this properly. And here we are. So we should be returning the error.message. Let's just double check that this is working. So again, Chris and a short password. And now it should say cannot read properties of code. So here's another problem. This was because we're using Firebase. So what we want to do instead is just get the error we get back. And this should actually be a message that we extract, right? So the message right here, and we'll pass this along here. So let's test this one more time, a short password, and it now should say invalid credentials. Okay, so that's now working over here when we have a wrong message. So assuming we get past all this and we're no longer throwing an error right here, what do we want to do next? Well, let's scaffold this out. The first thing I want to do is ask, does the user exist? So do they already exist in my database? If so, I don't want them to recreate a new user with everything else. Then I want to create a user ID. We're going to use this to pass it along to the front end using Astro's locals. Next, I want to hash the password, and that way it protects it. So a hash password. And then finally, we're going to create the user. And once we've done all that, then we're going to create session cookies. This will allow us to store these in the browser and access them whenever the user hits our site. And then eventually we will go ahead and redirect here as well, assuming that everything is good. Okay, so let's do these kind of one at a time. So I needed to first of all check if the user exists. Now I can check off the user name because that's a unique value. In fact, if I come back over to my config right over here, you can see that I've got this username be unique equals true. So I can check to see if they exist based on their username. So we'll just say like users matching or something like that. We'll set this to await DB. That should come in from Astro DB. There we go. Dot select. We're just going to select from a table. That table is called user. Remember? Again, I'll import that and that should pull in for me. Now there's a condition I want, and that is whenever two things are equal, the username that's been passed in and the username in my user database. The Drizzle ORM gives you the EQ function right here from Astro DB. I should be able to pull that in as well. And I want to check between two things, the user.username. So I want to check the entire database for a username in my user table that matches my username that has been passed in. Now this will return to us an array of matching users. If I come over here, you can see it will be an array right here. So what I want to do is just pick off the very first one. It should only ever return one that matches because it's a unique value. So we can check this in a couple of different ways. But for instance, I could come in here and just say if users matching dot length, it'll be 0 if there's nothing. So I can say if it's greater than 0, that means I do have a match already. So if it is greater than 0, that means I have a match. That means I want to throw a new error. And here it would be user already exists. So we'll see this in action later on, but all we're doing is checking that they don't exist. Now, assuming that they don't exist, I want to create a user ID. So let's declare a constant we'll call user ID. And we can get this from generate ID. And this is something that Lucia gives us. And I just need to pass a number of a number of letters I want it to be. In this case, let's do something like 16. All right, so this should give me back a string right here that's 16 characters in length. Next, let's hash the password. So I've created a user ID. I've already gotten a username and a password from the user, but I want to hash that password, so I'm not storing like raw passwords in my database. Now, in the first video in this section, we installed a package called Oslo. This comes from the same creator as Lucia, and it gives us certain helpers that allow us to do things like hash passwords. So let's just call this something like hashed password. Again, we'll declare this in a constant. We're going to simply await new Argon 2 ID like this, and it should come from Oslo password. And you can see that comes in right up here, right? All I'm going to do is do .hash. So this is a method that lives on this, where we'll pass in the password like this. So this should hash the password that the user gave us. Now, once all that is done, I want to create a user with my user ID, the hashed password, and the username that the user passed in. This is just standard Astro DB stuff. So let's do await db.insert. We're going to insert into the user table, and the values will simply be those three things. The ID, that will be the user ID we just created. The username, this will just be the username that the user passed in, and then we'll have the password hash, which will be the hashed password that we just created. Okay, so let's first of all make sure that this is working. If I come over here, we add a name like Chris and a password like something and hit create, something should have happened. If I come back over here, in this .astro folder, the content.db is an actual database file that we can access. Now, I happen to have an extension that lets you do this. It's just an SQLite viewer. There's bunches of these. You can check it out. But you can see that now I've got the hash password. I've got the created field, which was done automatically, my username, and then also that generated ID that I created. Now, over here, there's nothing yet in the session ID. That's what Lucia will do for us in just a moment. But it is actually working, and that's the important thing. So let's come back over here, create session. So let's come back over here. And in fact, maybe let's test that error message. If I have the same username, it should throw an error now, right? So if I try to do this, it will say, you can't do this, all right? The username needs to be unique. All right, could be a better error message, but the point is clear enough, all right? If you want to update that, you're welcome to do that. Let's now create a session cookie. Now again, Lucia gives you helpers for this, so you don't have to do all this yourself. Really nice and easy to work with. And again, you get to own all your users' data. So I'll come in here and we're going to await Lucia, and this should import here. Lucia, and this should import here from our actual auth folder, right? Because this is our own Lucia instance. So that's what I want to do. Create session right here. And I simply want to pass in two things, the user ID, and then optionally I can pass in a session ID. Now we don't have that, so right now I'm just going to leave it like that because we're going to create a session cookie here in just a second with our own session ID. So come in here, const session cookie, and here we'll grab Lucia once again. This time though, we're going to use create session cookie. Here we just need to pass the session.id. Now this session right here is something that Lucia is going to add using that Drizzle ORM adapter and actually add it to our database for us. So we don't have to do all that ourselves like this. It does that for us and returns to us an ID, expires that, and the user connection to our user database. So that's why I can access the ID right here. Finally, let's add these cookies to the browser. So context.cookies. So we need to have access to the context here. And I think the way we set this up originally, we only needed the request. So I should probably actually grab the context right here. So let's not destructure request so I can get the entire context object that comes along. And then this will be context.request. And I think all the rest of our things are fine here. Yeah. Okay. So let's come back down here. Now we've got access to the entire context object. Here we want to take the cookies and we want to set a few things. We're going to set the key and then the value and finally the options. So session cookie.name is our name. Session cookie.value is our value. And finally, session cookie.attributes is our attributes. So again, this is all coming from Lucia Auth. It kind of generates all this stuff for us. We don't have to worry about that. We just have to set it on the browser. Now, once all of that is done, we should be able to come in here and just return a redirect to the home page. So return context.redirect, and we're just going to return this to the home route. So that means I can get rid of this right here. We don't need that return statement anymore. So we've now got it to where it successfully creates a user by first checking if they exist, generating a user ID, hashing their password, creating this in our user table, then creating the session and setting it on the cookie and setting the cookie on the browser, and then finally redirecting us. If there are any errors, this little catch block will catch it for us right here. So let's go ahead and test this out. If I create something, we're going to call it like Jojo. All right, we'll come in here and say something and create account. So let me jump over this way and look inside here. Let's look at this content DB. And if I close this down, we should now have this session cookie. That's right. And I should also have another user whose name is Jojo. Perfect. All right, let's come inside here and let's also look at the application. So in Chrome, you do it like this. We're going to look at the cookies right here. And let's get rid of a couple of these that don't matter. And I don't actually see this set here. So let's try again. And let me refresh this. Christopher. All right, here we go. Create account. There we go. Our auth cookie session is right here. And it should have redirected us to the homepage. I'm not entirely sure why it didn't. I'm wondering if it has to do with the way we're reloading this page. So right now I'm not going to worry about that because it is successfully creating it over here. And we do actually have it here as well. And these two things should match. So if I come over here and we refresh, here we go right here. We haven't logged a user out yet. So that's something else we'd want to do. So right now we've got two different session cookies that are valid according to our database, but only one that's actually valid in the browser. So that might also be messing us up a little bit, but you can see that here this ID matches the same ID I have over here. Okay, so we've successfully got ourselves creating an account. Let's also make sure that we can log out. That'll be a little simpler. And then finally, we will log in using our own function as well. All right, you ready to log this user out? You might remember here, we've got this form action that hits this logout.json. So let's open that up. That's where all the logic is going to exist right over here. Now, obviously, we're not using Firebase anymore, so we can get rid of this. And I'm actually going to get rid of all this as well. Let's just get rid of this, and we'll replace all this functionality with Lucia Auth. Now, the way we're going to check for the user is by looking on the locals object. So we actually have to have something in the locals object for that to work. So for that, I need to do two things. Let's first of all come over to the middleware. And what we want to do is up top here, we want to grab a couple of things. The first thing we want to do is whenever any route is hit, we want to see if there is a session ID. Now, this is a cookie we're going to check for, context.cookies.get, and we're simply going to look for Lucia, and I'll pull that in from the .auth module, Lucia, and that should import from my .auth file, and then we'll do session cookie name. So this should tell us if there is a cookie, and let's just check to see that the value exists. If it doesn't exist, we'll use this nullish coalescing operator to simply set it to null. So if I come over here and we refresh this after I console log, you should see that I get nothing because I haven't created an account since I restarted my dev server. If, however, I come over here and I say Chris and something and hit create account, now I should get a session ID. All right, that should be in the cookie, should also now be in my database thanks to Lucia Auth, who does all that for me. So let's do a simple little check here, and we'll refactor this later, but I'm going to grab the session ID and say if it does exist, I want to do a few things. I want to first of all validate the session. Now, Lucia will actually look inside my database and make sure that everything matches properly for me, and it will give me back two things from a validate session method. It will give me the session, and it will give me the user. Those are the two things I said I need, and I'll get this from Lucia again. So Lucia like this, .validate session, and then we're going to pass it the session ID. Now we need to await, so that means I need to change this to an async function here. And now once I get these back, I should get a session and a user. So let's go ahead and just double check this. And now this should give me everything. So yep, there's my ID, there's my user ID, and all that rest. All right, cool. So let's come inside here, and we've actually got the session and the user. We're going to use these to set the locals object to include both the session and the user. So I'll say context.locals.session, and this will be equal to session. And then we'll do the same thing here, except we're going to set the user as well. So we should get along a user and a session that are attached to the locals object. Now you might remember this is something that lives and dies within single routes, which is why we want it in the middleware so that every new route passes this on so that each page can actually access both the session and the user. Those pages would include things like our routes, our API routes. Now, in order to get type safety, I need to open up my env.d.ts file and here declare a new namespace. We've done this before when we started working with the locals object. So let's declare a new namespace. We'll call this app, and then the interface will be locals. Now, we need two things here. We need the session and we need the user. Now, thankfully, we can import this from Lucia. So we'll say import lucia.session. So it'll either exist in that form, that structure that we expect, or it will not be there at all. Then I'm going to grab this and this and change these both to user. Now, where are we getting this? Well, if I come back to my index auth, you'll remember that the adapter passed a session and a user. So that's what we're picking off and using here to define how our local should look. So if I come back over here to our middleware, you'll see that now these are not getting type errors. And in fact, if I were to look at these, they know exactly what they expect. So now with every single route, I have this session and user existing. In fact, just to prove that, let's go ahead and open up the index file. I'm going to open up index right here. And here, instead of saying successfully logged in, let's actually have the user's name. So I'll say you are successfully logged in. And now let's actually get the user here. So I'm going to come in here. We'll just destructure user. This will come from astro.locals. So down this way, assuming that we have a user, then I just want to grab the user.username. Now if I come back over here and we just look at the home route, it says, Chris, you are successfully logged in. Now, how is he getting access to this? Well, that's in the middleware right here where we're setting it because there is a session ID. Now, that also means we can come over here and optionally show this whole section if the user is logged in using the layout. So let's come up here. We'll just destructure here the session from astro.locals. And we'll just say that if there is a session when it renders this page, again, we're using server-side rendering, then so we can do this kind of dynamically. We'll say if there is a session, then we'll go ahead and log the form. So there it is right there. Okay, cool. Last thing we need to do is actually log them out, which is the whole point of this section, right? This whole video. So there's two scenarios. One is that they are not logged in, and one is that they are logged in. Now, if they're not logged in, they shouldn't be able to hit this route, but they might somehow. So I'll come in here and say context.locals.session. If that does not exist, which means I need to pass in the context right here. If that does not exist, then I just simply want to return a new response. This will just be null and status of 401. Again, they shouldn't ever really hit that, but just in case, that's what we're going to do. Now, what we want to do is invalidate their session cookies. So I'm going to wait. Again, from Lucia, I'll import that. And it's got an invalidate session method. Again, since we're kind of building this ourselves, it gives us all the little building blocks that we can now assemble to build our own auth. So I'm going to grab the context.locals, .session.id. Because it knows the type, the structure, it's really easy to just do dot and pick the next thing you need. Then what we're going to do is create a new blank session cookie and set that. So let's come in here. We'll say const session cookie. And again, from Lucia, we're going to do create blank session cookie right here. We don't need to pass anything in here. Now, this is the same basic thing we did when we were creating a new user. So let's come over here to create.json. Here we used create session cookie because we actually wanted to create a session. Here we're using a blank session cookie and logout. But everything after that is the same. I'm going to take the session cookie and I'm going to use the name for the blank one, the value for the blank one, and the attributes for the blank one, and set that on the browser. And then finally, I do need to return, since this is a post route. And now that they're logged out, I want to simply redirect them to the login page. So assuming we did that correctly, we should be able to come over here and log out, and it should redirect us to the login page. Now, I'm not entirely sure why it's not redirecting us, but the middleware is going to take care of that anyhow, so let's not worry about it now. You can see, though, we are logged out because it no longer says the user's name. So if I come over here to the login page, we now need to log in, and that's what we're going to do in the next lesson. All right, we've created a new account. We've logged out that account. Now it's time to log in. So I'm over here in the login.js.ts file, which we created earlier with Firebase. We're just going to get rid of a lot of this stuff right here. So that won't matter. And we also don't need this right here. Okay, so let's go ahead and do the same kind of thing where we're going to grab the email and the password. We're going to make sure that these things are valid according to our own database and go from there. So everything will be done inside this try catch loop. And the first thing we're going to do is just validate the inputs once again. So I'm actually going to come over to the create one, and we'll just copy a lot of this because it should be the exact same. So we're going to validate the inputs, and if they are not valid, then we'll just reject it because we know it couldn't fit in our database anyhow, so we don't even need to check our database. So let me go ahead and pull this in here. Validate inputs right here, and we need this to say username from here, username, which also means I need to come to my login Astro file and change these like we did before to username. This type is the type of text. Other than that, we should be set to go. Let's come back over here. Now we should be getting username and password, and we can pass these along and just double check that they meet our basic requirements. Obviously, you probably want to do more checks than this, but just a basic tutorial hopefully will give you a sense of how this works, and you can build this out more fully for an actual production app. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is check to see if the user exists, because if the user doesn't exist, we don't need to check the password. So again, let's come over here. We can grab a lot of the same kind of stuff right over here. And we'll say if the user exists. Now let's go ahead and pull in the DB from Astro DB. User, we got to pull that in too. And EQ, we got to pull that in as well. So all three of those should be right here, and they are cool. Now in this case, what we want to do is to check to make sure that the user does exist. So we actually want there to be something that comes back, right? So what I can do is just say if it's less than 1, in other words, if they don't exist, what I'm going to do is instead of giving specifics here, I don't want to tell them that a user doesn't exist in case somebody's trying to like brute force attack this. I can just simply say incorrect username or password. What we're doing now is just saying, hey, this doesn't match. They don't actually know that the user doesn't exist at all. Again, you might want to handle this more robustly, but this will work for our basic use case. Now, once I check that the user exists, we now want to check that the password is valid. So is the password valid? All right. That'll be our next question to answer. So let's declare a new constant. We're going to call it valid password, and we'll check this. And we'll use a new argon2 ID. This comes from Oslo. Here we don't want to hash it now. We want to verify it. Now to verify it, it needs two things. It needs the hash password from our database, and then it needs the password that they have entered manually in the front end. So let's go ahead and grab those two things. We should have users matching right here. There should only be one on that. So let's grab the first instance. And now what I want to do is grab the password hash. Secondly, then I'll pass in the password that they have typed in. So we're going to compare the typed in password versus the one we have stored in our database. Now, similarly, if it's not true, so let's bring this down this way. If it's not a valid password, so we can just check this with this bang valid password, then we'll simply pass back once again, incorrect username or password. Okay, so now we've verified that the user exists and that the username is correct. We've also verified that the password matches the hashed password we have in our database. Next, let's create the session cookie. And this once again should be very similar to what we've already done. We don't have to generate an ID because we're not creating it or hash the password or insert them into the database, but we do need to do this right here. So let's go ahead and do that. So here, let's make sure that we pull down Lucia. That should work. And we don't have a user ID that we're generating anymore. We're actually going to get this from the user that matches. So let's come in here. We're going to grab the first user that matches, should be the only one because they're unique usernames. And then we'll simply pick off the ID. Once we got that, we will then generate a new session cookie and set this on the context, which means I need to make sure that I've got the context. Same kind of thing we had to do before, where we get the entire context object, and now we do context.request here. And down here, we should have access to the context. Now, assuming all this is correct, we can simply redirect here. So I'll just return context.redirect. We'll just redirect to the home page now that they've logged in successfully. If they haven't, or we run into any errors, we want to go ahead and capture it the same way we did before. So let me open back up our create.json, and I'm just going to copy this entire catch block, and that should respond the exact same way. So let's grab this right here, and we'll just respond the same way, where we'll pass along the error message and or just the whole error if it doesn't know if it's a type of error. Okay, so let's go ahead and see if this works. I have a username Chris and a password, and I log in and something happened. All right, you can see that we've now got this logout button, which means it's actually working. If I log out here, now you don't see that anymore, which tells us again that the user doesn't exist. In fact, if I come over here to the home page, you can see it right here. Obviously, we haven't protected this yet with middleware, but if I were to come over here and log in and then go to the home page right here, you'll see Chris, you are successfully logged in. And then our error messages should work here as well. So if I come back over here and we say Chris 2, and then I try to log in, you'll see it says incorrect username or password. If I say Chris, but I have the wrong password, and I click login, it says incorrect username or password. By my count, that gives us just one more thing to do, and that is to finalize our middleware file, and that's what we'll do in the next video. We've got just one more thing to do, and that is to finalize our middleware file. Now, so far, we've kind of slightly handled this session ID. We also need to handle it if it does not exist. So let's come over here. We're going to say if there is no session ID, so if no session ID, then there's a couple things we want to do. First of all, we want to create the same blank session token that we did when we logged out. So once again, let's not duplicate ourselves. Well, actually, let's definitely duplicate ourselves by copying this over. And you could obviously extract a lot of this out into little helper functions if you want as well, but this should work for us. The last thing I need to do, though, is to set the context.locals.user to null, and then we'll do the same thing here for the session. So I want to nullify those so that that's what's passed back to the browser. And then I want to do a little check, and it's similar to the check we did before. If I come back down here, we have this right here, path name, all this kind of stuff. This is the same thing we want. So there's no ID. It's gone ahead and cleared out the locals here and set a blank session cookie. Now I simply want to check to see if the path name equals create or login, and to make sure that it is a GET request. Now I don't yet have path name, so I need to grab that as well. So maybe let's just do that right here. We'll just destructure path name from my context.url. Okay, so if it equals create or login and it's a GET request, then what I want to do is go ahead and return a context.redirect where I redirect the user to log in. So they're not logged in, it clears out the session cookie, sets the locals object to null for both session and user, and then it checks the path that we're on. If we're not on create or login, and if it is a GET request, so in other words, it's going to ignore our post requests, then it will go ahead and return us to the login route. So let's go ahead and check that out. I got to recreate a user since I restarted my dev server, something like this. Okay, perfect. So if I'm not logged in and I try to go to the homepage, so right now I can go to the homepage, but if I log out here, it should redirect me to the login. And even if I try to go over here, it will not let me. It'll just keep redirecting me here to the login. Okay, so that's the log out method functionality set. Let's now worry about if we do have a session ID. We've gone ahead and set the session and the user here on our locals object, but there's one more thing I want to do in between here. According to Lucia's documentation, it's possible that on the session we get back, we have a fresh property set to true. If that's the case, I actually want to regenerate my session cookies. So I'm going to check the session, and I'm going to check that the session.fresh is true. Assuming that that's the case, I want to redo creating my session cookies. So once again, let's go ahead and copy over from our create. We could also do it from a login as well. It's going to use the same kind of thing right here. So let's go ahead and grab this and jump back over this way. And actually, I don't need this on my session. I already have a session. So I need to pass it in right here, and we should be set to go. So I just had to remove that first line. Okay, then we can go ahead and update this right here, the session and the user. And then finally, we need to do the same kind of check down below. So we'll say if, and here we're going to capture this right here. If the path name is create or login, and I'm already logged in, I don't want to let them go there. So here I'll return a redirect. So context.redirect, we'll just redirect them to the home route. Now there's a couple of other scenarios I need to handle, and basically all of them would just mean I pass on this right here where I just return next. So think about this. If somebody comes in and they're not logged in, I'm going to bring them right here. I'm going to invalidate all their session cookies, set the locals objects, user and session to null, and then I'm going to check to see the path name that they're on. If they're not on create or login and it's a GET request, I'm going to return them to the login. If they are on the login though, I'm never going to hit this right here. I actually need to pass along, hey, just keep them where they're at, right? Keep them on the login page. So that's what the return next does. Same kind of thing here. If there's a session ID, I go ahead and refresh it if necessary, and then I set it in the locals object. And then here I'm going to check if it is create or login, then I'm going to redirect them to the home page because I don't want them to be able to access these two things. However, if they are already on the home page, I still need to pass that request along, and that's what I've done right here. Now, there's one other thing we need to account for, and that is we can do some basic cross-site request forgery blocking. And Astro has actually given us this as an experimental feature. Normally, you'd want to do this in your middleware somewhere. What I'm going to do is come over, though, to my Astro config. So config.mjs right here. And we're just going to add a new property here called experimental. And we're going to look at the experimental features. Here, I'm going to set the security object here with CSRF protection. And we'll just set the origin to true. In other words, it's checking the origin to make sure that it matches with my actual domain. So that's one little bit of basic protection you can add. Now I should be able to come over here and actually let's create a new account and I'll call this Chris2 and the password will be something. I create a new account. Chris2, you are successfully logged in. You are now seeing protected content. If I try to come over here, let's just double check that everything is working. I try to go to create, it shouldn't let me. If I try to go to login, it should not let me. Now, as soon as I log out, it should redirect me to the login page. And we already tested this, but it shouldn't let me go there. It should let me go to the create page though, and this should be fine. So it's handling all the cookies and kind of giving us the building blocks to build our own auth system. Now, if you want to use this in production, you'll probably want to add a little bit more robust error handling. And you'll also need to remember to connect Astro DB to Astro Studio, and then go ahead and set up an auth key for your provider like Vercel or Netlify or whatever you're using so it can actually do this in production. Finally, you might remember that when you actually build it, your build script needs to include the remote flag, and that way you can actually access your production database on build. If any of those details don't make sense, I just encourage you to look back at the Astro DB module or look at the Astro docs to remember how to set that all up for an actual production site. Hey, Chris from the future here. Before we move on, I wanted to just note at the end of this video that right after I posted this, they updated the config here to where it's no longer experimental. You simply have to pass security and then do check origin equals true. You'll see that when enabled, this performs a check that the origin header automatically passed by all modern browsers matches the URL sent by each request. Now, there are a couple of other qualifications about when this is needed, but since we added this, I just wanted to swap it out here, and that way we've got it in the most modern format. So to do that, I'm going to jump over this way and kill this, and we'll just run npx astrojs upgrade, and this should upgrade everything to the most modern version, which at this point I think is 4.9. And I stand corrected, it's 4.9.2, but close enough, right? Let's get this back up and running with npm run dev. And now we need to come over here and switch this out. In fact, if we don't, you'll see here it tells us that we've got something wrong. So I'm going to get rid of this experimental object right here. And we're just going to have security, and we'll just simply pass origin equals true. All right, hopefully that should work. Let's come back over here and rerun this npm run dev to make sure that this is working. Okay, and just like that, we've got the setup for the modern syntax for CSRF protection. Well, that was auth 3 different ways, but I hope that really helped you understood the power of middleware and how you might implement auth on your own. In the next module, we're going to look at one of Astro's really cool kind of snazzy features, and this is view transitions. Not only does it use the built-in view transitions in modern browsers, but it has really graceful fallbacks for browsers that don't support it.